I don't think that we're grateful enough for all the great athletes that are currently in activity and for all of the great performances that we're able to see. Because talent is a thing, but it's not all about talent. Because if it was just about talent, we would have a whole lot more great athletes. And I actually have 3 Olympic weightlifters that I'd like to discuss as being potentially some of the best of all time, or at least could have been some of the best of all time, and that just didn't quite make it, either due to themselves or to external stuff. So let's talk about wasted talents. So we'll start chronologically from the nearest from us, and this will be a lifter that last competed pretty recently, less than 10 years ago. He comes to us from Russia, and his name is Ketak Kugaev. Ketak is arguably the most talented lifter of the last decade, or even of the last 15 years really. And I know that's quite of a big thing to say, knowing that we've had guys like Lashata Hadze, Luke Xiaojun, Carlos Nazar, Ilya Ilin, things like this, but he was something different. And I don't think people are talking about him just quite enough. So the first incredible video of Ketak Kugaev that I can remember, and maybe the craziest, is back when he was 14 years old. So he weighed 69 kilos, and we have a video of him hitting a 174 kilos block clean. At the time, the senior world record was 198 kilos. So that was right around 90% of the all-time world record at 14 years old. To understand how crazy this is, I feel like I have to remind you all that the average weightlifter doesn't really reach his peak till quite a bit later in their life. If we're talking about a lighter lifter, it might be toward the end of its junior years, which would be 20 years old, or a little bit later, 20 to 22 years old. Most top lifters would reach peak form right around 25 to 28 years old. So of course this is an incredible lift and it's a proof of talent, but there are plenty of talented lifters, there are plenty of talented athletes that shows great promise when they're younger and never quite deliver on it. But in a way, Ketak did deliver on it, and he delivered on it pretty incredibly. So the second video that I want to mention is 2 years later, when he was 16 years old. He was, I think, 94 kilos already at this point, but he might have been quite a bit lighter. And right there, he clean and jerked 200 kilos in training, which is maybe one of the easiest 200 kilo clean and jerk you will ever see. Now, that almost doesn't sound as impressive nowadays because of guys like Carlos Nazar, obviously, who clean and jerked a world record at 17 years old at 81 kilos, over 200 kilos at a lighter body weight. But at the time, and even honestly to this day, 200 kilos as a youth lifter is a big deal. It's a really big deal. And I think that he truly delivered right around the same time at the Youth Olympic Games. So if you don't know what this is, it's just the Olympics, but for youth lifters and for youth athletes in general. There he won, and that was pretty much his first big win, and it was in 2014. The following year, he was making his debut on the senior ranks at 17 years old. For a little reference point, there are only 3 lifters that ever won the World Championships at 17 years old, which are Ilya Ilin, Carlos Nazar, and Sevdalin Marinov back in 1985. So this is basically who he's competing against when he's showing up at the European Championships. And he didn't disappoint. So at this young age, he snatched 180 kilos and he clean and jerked 219 kilos. That wasn't enough for the win, interestingly enough, that day, but it's still a pretty incredible total. And I want to also compare it to the first total of Ilya Ilin at the World Championships at 18 years old actually. In 2006, Ilya made his debut at the World Championships at 94 kilos, and there he snatched 175 kilos and clean and jerk 217. Of course, he did attempt 233 twice, missed the clean, but his final total was only 392. That's 7 kilos under what Ketak Kugaev did on his very first competition. Now, does that mean that Ketak could have had the potential to go on and become the next Ilya? Who knows? Because the truth is that after this competition, he will more or less disappear from the surface of Earth. There are 2 big reasons for that. The first one will be purely politics. after 2015 and just before the Rio Olympics, Russia will kind of be sidelined from weightlifting as a whole, and as a consequence, young prospects like Ketakugaev just weren't able to compete anymore. But there was a second reason that is more lifter dependent, which is that he didn't live up to the pressure very well. It was a lot for him to take, and because of this, he suffered what is rumored to be some kind of mental breakdown. He just stopped training. You know, he just couldn't take it anymore. The pressure of being such a huge talent at such a young age is not something that everyone can take. It's something that guys like Ilya Ilyin, Carlos Nazar that we've mentioned have been able to take on, and they have been able to become exactly the lifter that people expected them to be. But once again, these are the exceptions, and sadly Ketakugaev wasn't one of the exceptions. So just before we move on to the next lifter, I want to mention something that people don't seem to be too familiar about, but Ketak did compete as recently as less than 5 years ago. He obviously wasn't anywhere near his level of 2015 despite being quite a bit older, but he's still reasonably young. He is just 27 years old, which would usually be a reasonable peak for any lifter of his body weight, but yeah, he just never managed to get back from this. Our next lifter comes to us from Iran, and his name is Saeed Ali Hosseini. Saeed is a little bit of a weird one because his career as a youth lifter and as a junior was maybe even less impressive to the untrained eye. So in 2006, at 18 years old, he competed at his first junior world championships, snatched 181 kilos, clean and jerk 215 kilos, 396 kilo total, and he won. Just want to mention that as a super heavyweight, he did total 3 kilos less than Ketakugaev that we mentioned earlier. But anyway, the real interesting thing about Saeed Ali Hosseini is his 2008 years, so his last year as a junior lifter. He will have one performance in particular that is absolutely incredible. He snatched 206 kilos and he clean and jerked 245 kilos as a junior lifter. So this needs a little bit of context once again. Before Ali Hosseini, there were two records that were standings. The snatch record was 205 kilos for any junior lifter in the history of the sport. It was held by Ronnie Waller and was set back in 1989 at 110 kilos, which is important to note, and it's one of my favorite lifts ever. I'll put it on the screen right here. But that was a standing record. And for the total, the all-time best junior was Stefan Botev. He did 445 kilos, also in the 110 category, interestingly enough. So these were the standing records. And Saeed Ali Hosseini, seemingly out of nowhere, kind of crushed them. This 206 is, to this day, the heaviest junior snatch of all time, and his 451 kilo total is the heaviest junior total of all time. Now, someone did get pretty close to this list just last year at Worlds, and it will be interesting to see the trajectory of this lifter. Hopefully he won't end up in such a list. But either way, Saeed Ali Hosseini is arguably the greatest junior lifter of all time, or at least the strongest junior lifter of all time. So what happened? Well, the first thing will be something I didn't mention. In 2006, he did win Worlds, but he didn't compete for 2 years. That wasn't just because he decided not to compete, that was because he was caught doping. So he took a 2 years ban and came back stronger, as most weightlifters do really. And he competed in 2008, once again he set these records, and then he was caught doping again. So what that meant at the time was that his career was over. That's a little bit of an odd thing, but on his second positive drug test, he was banned for life from weightlifting. A little bit tough, especially on a junior lifter, especially when you can imagine that in a country like Iran, he might not have been taking PEDs from his own accord, but that's just how it is. But luckily for him, a little bit later, his sentence was reduced to 12 years, and then a little bit later, it was reduced to 8 years. And so what that meant was that 9 years after his last international competition, Saeed Ali Hosseini will come back to competitive weightlifting, and he will actually do very well. He will compete at the 2017 World Championships, and he will take a silver medal just behind Lashata Hatse. There he snatched 203 and clean and jerk 251, so a record. But all of these competitions don't really show the full picture. The thing is that Ali Hosseini was a strong kid, and he was a strong guy overall. There are multiple videos of him snatching 210 kilos as a junior lifter. There are also multiple videos of him clean and jerking 250 kilos or more as a junior lifter. He was maybe one of the biggest talent of the super heavyweight ranks ever, and overall he was just insanely strong. There is this video of him deadlifting 370 kilos, which is one of the craziest lifts of all time made by a weightlifter, because he doesn't have straps on and it's clearly more of a clean pull than a deadlift. But yeah, for Saeed Ali Hosseini it were drugs that kind of signed his downfall. Now for third and last lifter. His name is Alexander Purvi, and it might be one of the most tragic stories in the history of weightlifting, so we'll keep the tone a little bit down on this one. Alexander Purvi was from Ukraine, and he was born all the way back in 1960. So he was one of the golden child of the late 70s, early 80s in weightlifting. He was a part of Team USSR, of course, and his first achievement really was the 1980 Europeans, where he finished third. He was not even 20 years old back then, and he straight away moved on to the Olympics, the 75 kilo Olympics in Moscow in 1980. There he competed against Asen Zlatev, which ended up becoming the strongest clean and jerker, and actually the strongest snatcher also of the 82.5 kilo weight class. And he did exceptionally well. In 1980, Alexander Purvi became the lightest man ever, at this point at least, to clean and jerk 200 kilos. He did 200 kilos at 75 kilos. Granted, it was broken just after by Asen Zlatev, who did a little bit more than that. And of course, we then had Alexander Vorbanov, which 4 years later did 200 kilos in the category under that. But still, this 200 kilo was enough for the silver medal, and at 19 years old, Alexander Purvi was an Olympic medalist. So that was quite an achievement, of course, but he had a problem. He was in a similar but also different way than Ketakue. He was a little bit weak-minded, but more in the way of partying. His thing was partying. He liked to go out, he liked to drink, he liked to do a lot of things that way, and that was pretty dramatic. Of course, while he was successful, that was all nice and fine. But later on, it kind of ruined his life. But still, 1981, 1982, he kept going strong, and he actually beat the world record of Yurik Vardanyan in the clean and jerk at 82.5 kilos. So he clean and jerked 223.5 kilos. And by the same occasion, he became one of only 4 men to ever total 400 kilos while weighing under 82.5 kilos. That was an achievement, and for a while it really seemed like Purvi would be able to fight it up against Yurik Vardanyan, which ended up becoming the third best weightlifter of all time, and against Asen Zlatev, which, as mentioned just before, was one of the greatest lifters of the category. But his drinking and his partying caught up to him, and following a doctor visit, he had to stop his career. He had a heart condition that made it dangerous for him to train, and because of this, he had to leave the USSR team and go build himself a life somewhere else. This is something that he sadly didn't manage to do. And at 25 years old, Alexander Purvi will pass away. He was maybe the greatest talent of the sport. He could have been maybe more than any other lifter I mentioned, and maybe more than any other lifters ever, could have been the greatest lifter of all time. But sometimes things don't go as planned, and sometimes life don't go as planned. So the next time you see a great lifter on the platform, remember this. We're lucky to have them there.